Oh, well, this is terrible. I just told the whole story and I thought I was streaming and nothing was going out. I could have sworn I pressed to start streaming. So that means we're going to have to redo the stream. Oh, I don't believe it. I just told a pretty heart-wrenching story about something. So we'll have to do this again. So for 8 minutes we were offline. I'm sorry, I thought I pressed the start stream and nothing occurred. So nobody's connected. We'll have to post the live stream again. Let's see, because the URL is going to be different. Okay, welcome back. I made a mistake. I thought I was streaming for the whole time, and I told this terrible story about from my what occurred when I lived on the other side of Toronto, and I'm not going to take myself through this. I think I'll leave it for another time. But it makes me cry because it has to do with the predators and this young girl that they found in a valley where when I still was in grade 6, 7 or 8, sometime around there. Let me see. I'm just gonna take care of the stream because we'll have to get people reconnected and tell them where the stream is. Okay, so where am I here? Douglas isn't back yet. I have to repost the stream.
Okay, I'm back.
Okay.
I hear somebody typing. Paul's typing.
So
yes, and
I was so concentrating on what I was saying because I drenched out this heart-wrenching story about predators and the couple of deaths that actually that ended up being close to where I lived when I was younger in the 90s, and that happened there. But then I realized when I checked, I realized I wasn't streaming. This happened second time where I think the button is pressed and then it wasn't, like when I was off mute, I could have sworn I pressed the button, but I think it didn't, the software didn't register it, and I don't know if the same thing happened here with the streaming. But right now we are live. I posted a link, and I think we'll have to inform people of that link because it's going to be different. Okay, so some people are connecting, but we had a lot of people connected, and we're about
we got one already. Yep.
So we got about a quarter of the people connected. So
11 are watching right now.
Yeah.
And let me put the link up. I'll change everything to the new link.
Okay, Daniel Arola says we're back. Daniel Arola says we're back. Yeah. I saw Daniel. I saw your request.
Well, I'm assuming we recorded everything.
Well, everything's recording now, but when I was talking,
I'm sorry.
When I was talking, I wasn't. It wasn't even streaming, so I wasn't recording myself. That's okay. I'll retell the stories some other time. But they have to do with the predators. They were like personal experience. How close it came to myself. I mean, I could retell them, but I nearly started crying when I retold the second one. So it might be better if you just take over and continue while, or at least post the link.
Sure. I mean, let me change. Yeah, I'll post the new link and stuff. But what I mean to say is, I'm assuming everybody heard me till now because nobody seems to be saying we went off. They seem to have, they seem to have like been with us for all this time, and so Ramona Halitha Henry is going to retreat for the evening. So what I'm saying is that it seems that we were heard until I went off. Is what seems to be the case.
Everything's there. It's just I stopped the stream after you left, just to to get it to save and sort of reflush it. But usually what I do is I started within a minute, and I was waiting, and I was sure I pressed start, and so I started talking, retelling what I was gonna say, and then I realized it wasn't streaming when I went over to the YouTube page, and when I checked the encoder was not streaming. So I don't know what occurred. I guess I missed it somehow. But everything you said is recorded, and everything, and we've been recording since you came back. So everything's set now. Everything's going.
Right. So what? Right. and what I mean to say is that you know, along with that, what we can do is have you retell the story about the predators and the deaths, you know, on our next transmission.
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah, that's what
on Wednesday.
Sounds good. Yeah, I'll do it then.
To open. Yeah, to open. And so right now what I'm doing, and I'm just letting everybody know, is I'm just changing the links everywhere, and am going to kind of do some serious reposting, just a little new reposting here, and get everything up to get people to make certain that we don't lose everybody, or so that new people can join. And this is all part of you know, our new stream that we've just established, and we want people to not miss out. And so you're just going to hear me kind of awkwardly filling in some airtime, as we used to say. Back in the day when there was terrestrial broadcast radio. Of course, I've never been part of terrestrial broadcast radio, but, you know, the digital bandwidth radio, if we can still call it radio, digital bandwidth transmissions still follow much of the old form of what people who were actually paid used to follow. People who were actually nationally syndicated, instead of guys like you know, my man Pavel and I, working out of our relative domiciles, and just kind of like inching along and trying to make do, and ultimately will require your support to do so. And hopefully that'll be coming at some point when we get things to process such up and running. Now, aside from all of that, I'm going to be continuing for probably another 1 to 2 hours, 1 hour more at the very least, maybe around 2. So let me get this published. Okay, now we'll take that singular link and let's post that to the top, pin this to the top of my page. And all of this may sound like utter nonsense to people who are unfamiliar with Facebook, but what I'm doing is I'm publishing links. So I've got to change the links in the old promotional banner, and that'll be just one last thing to do to irritate everybody, to take us to the quarter of the hour. And in the meantime, we want to thank our man Pavel for doing his best. And here we are. Here's my old promotional banner, tagged to 100 people. And let's change that link there. There we are. Cut and paste that. And other than that, I hope everybody's been grabbing themselves some snacks, been relieving themselves, and getting themselves back into a more comfortable position. And hopefully, as we get more used to this break period, we'll be able to adapt to, you know, not having the stream kind of die on us. It's a very quirky system. And with YouTube transferring to the beta format, which is not directly connected to this phenomenon at all, YouTube itself has become a bitch to use. I'm happy to say that my promotional banner for tonight's program has received it's performing 90% better than other posts on my page. So we're getting great results with this. And hopefully people that I know and love are all still listening. The Grand Madam Ramona Halitha Henry having, of course, retreated into slumber. I'm going to continue narrative. And I thank everyone for their patience. So when I think of Donald John Trump's apologists who validate his victim mentality, what comes to my mind most immediately in terms of back when Manafort was arrested yesteryear, actually the year before yesteryear, in the closing months of 2017, at that time, Rush Limbaugh's effort to bolster the Trump as victim narrative was offered while Manafort was being indicted. And to quote verbatim, he said this: "They had learned the Democrats in the media had learned that standard dirty tricks did not work on Trump, such as the Access Hollywood video. I mean, really, the Access Hollywood video, which, of course, he was, of course, describing how he physically and brutally assaulted women. He raped them against their will, sexually forced himself upon them, and bragged of it. That's like, you know, gee, that's just, you know, that's a dirty trick. Him bragging about rape is a dirty trick. And, you know, the mind boggles. The things that have always worked from the media and let me see this. If I can remember the way Rush Limbaugh said it, and I've got to kind of take up his accent. I can't get his voice just right. So I've got about 2 more statements of his that were all part of this, shall we say, conspiracy theory of his, or this, what would you call it? It would be like a mirror theory, taking the victim and making them the provocateur, taking the victimizer and making the victimizer the innocent victim. So to try and immerse myself in Rush Limbaugh, which be almost impossible, I'd need a lot of OxyContin, the hillbilly heroin that he was addicted to, which he used an illegal immigrant, his maid, to purchase by having her husband, who had been spinally injured, actually working for a living, get prescribed double doses of OxyContin so that she could turn them all over to Rush Limbaugh under threat that he would turn her over to Immigration and Customs Enforcement. I mean, the sleaziest white trash piece of shit you could fucking imagine. The son of a judge himself. Rush Limbaugh is an example of privileged victimhood that we're talking about, promoting other victims of privilege, or privileged victims. So, to try and immerse myself in Rush Limbaugh, let's see if I could do it. They had learned, the Democrats in the media had learned, that standard dirty tricks did not work on Trump, such as the Access Hollywood video. The things that have always worked from the media and the Democratic Party playbook to take out Republican candidates or Republican elected officials had not worked on Trump. They fired every weapon they had. They'd used as much ammo as they could muster to get rid of Trump in the traditional Democrat drive-by media dirty tricks technique, but none of it stuck. None of it worked. They couldn't dent Trump. They could not dent Trump's bonds with his voters. And there were enough of them, of course, to elect him president. So they decided they had to go outside the appearance of politics as usual. And what better way than to purchase and construct and write an intelligence document that was sourced by people in the Russian government and MI6. Okay, I've got to come down from that. Oh, I had to suck on a helium balloon for that one left over from the party. I'm sorry, I think it may be I. Oh, I should do that. Okay, what's so striking about what I just quoted isn't the attempt to discredit the dossier produced by Christopher Steele. It's the characterization of the Access Hollywood tape as a standard dirty trick of media Democrats, as if anyone other than Trump himself is to blame for donning a lapel mic, getting on an NBC bus with Billy Bush, and then telling him, you know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. Just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything. Grab them by the pussy. You can do anything. If you're a Rush Limbaugh listener, in which case you probably wouldn't be listening to me, you know that the talk radio host would have immediately aired and then exalted in audio of Bill Clinton or Barack Obama making those same statements, and that you'd regard his doing so as obviously fair game. Whether one thinks those comments suggest the many women accusing Trump of sexual improprieties are telling the truth, Trump predictably maintains that all 16 of them are victimizing him with lies. I mean, all 16. Bitches and cunts, you know. I mean, to the last. just victimizing this poor man with their lies. They, you know, they just wanted to be fucked by him so bad that they project him fucking them because, you know, he's so chaste. He wouldn't do anything like that in reality. Or, you know, you might think, of course, that the comments simply be hyperbolic locker room talk. The claim that it's a dirty trick to play a recording of Trump talking, it's obviously nonsense. It doesn't even it doesn't even bear dignifying with response, but nevertheless the situation be so dire that I must do so. And meanwhile, another Trump apologist that I could think of managed to cast Don Jr. as the victim, even as Don Jr. lied about a meeting that he held with a Russian promising dirt on Hillary Clinton. So when I think of Jesse B. Waters at Fox News, when he was speaking on Donald J. Trump Jr. meeting with the Russian attorney, he said, "I believe Don Jr. is the victim here. Hashtag the 5. I mean, do these people ever hold their allies responsible for anything? I mean, anything at all? And at its most extreme, the impulse among Trump cultists to portray themselves as victims inspired the deplorable act of creating a protest sign that read, "Rape Melania," to create the false impression that opponents of the president were saying that. All of this is doing irreparable damage to the nation, to American empire. Hate hoaxes are always wrong. America looks weak when its president and his apologists be constantly portraying themselves as victims. Children are ill-served by their example. And the military be mistreated when the president keeps passing the buck to generals when Americans be killed abroad. For all of those reasons and more, Trump's supporters should stop tolerating this ongoing victim mentality. But they thrive on it. At Real Donald Trump, he stated at Fox News, "Clinton campaign and DNC paid for research that led to the anti-Trump fake news dossier. The victim here is the president." I mean, Trump voters were promised a winner who would drain the swamp and make America great again. The whole hashtag MAGA. What they've gotten instead is a serial failure who never confronts or addresses his own failings and will therefore never remedy or overcome those failings. Erica Jong wrote, "Take your life in your hands, and what happens? A terrible thing. No one to blame. So expect more blame, finger-pointing, and pity parties fueled by pessimism, fear, and anger. And wonder not that just 33% of Americans tell Gallup they approve of Trump's erratic victimhood presidency. His disordered behavior will keep on harming American empire in these United States for the duration of his tenure. And Americans don't need the Mueller report to judge Trump. The fevered speculation about when the special counsel will conclude his work overshadows how much the public already knows about the president in Russia. Special counsel Robert Mueller's report could come out as soon as next week, so CNN reported last week, unless, of course, it doesn't. After all, there have been various suggestions for months that the end was in sight, and the Justice Department said Friday there would be no report next week. And anyway, none of this matters if the newly installed Attorney General Bill Barr decides not to release the report, or releases only a limited summary, or delays the release, or I could go on through morning. Because of the many uncertainties about when the report will arrive, and what the public will see, and what shape the report might take, and what steps might come next, the report has taken on outsized importance in discourse and coverage about the presidential campaign, Russia, and Donald Trump himself. That's risky, though. Perhaps the Mueller report will deliver a stunning new revelation about Trump's campaign or business ties, but it could just as plausibly turn out to be a short, dry summary of material that's already known, which be just the point. Regardless of the content or timing of the Mueller report, plenty of information be already available for the public to judge the president and his administration. Following the path of former President Richard Mulhouse Nixon's downfall, there's been a search for a smoking gun on par with his fateful White House tapes. But as I have spracheth before, there's been an arsenal of smoking guns sitting out in the open for years now. Or put differently, if this is a witch hunt, investigators have already found a coven. The existing knowledge comes from various sources. A great deal of it has been revealed in Mueller's indictments and other filings in the case, which have offered rich details about many incidents involving the president's associates. Other parts have emerged in press reports or through congressional investigations, and some of the relevant information pertains to acts that were done in the open, such as Trump ally Roger Stone's pronouncements about WikiLeaks. For example, the public already noticed that Trump pursued a building project in Moscow well into the presidential campaign, though originally his longtime aide Michael Cohen said that the effort ended in January of 2016. He later admitted that it actually went until June of that year, shortly before Trump was officially nominated as the Republican candidate. Trump Organization representatives were in touch with top Russian officials about the project and hatched a plan to give the penthouse of the building to Russian President Vladimir Putin himself as a gift. During the campaign, Trump repeatedly praised Putin and trudged at Russia's unlawful annexation of Crimea, an act of international aggression, an act of war. The candidate was, at the very least, misleading the public when he said he had no business in motherfucking Russia. Trump also publicly called on Russia to hack the emails of Hillary Clinton, his rival for the presidency, and the former Secretary of State. That same day, Russian hackers attempted for the first time to infiltrate Clinton's email server. According to court filings, Stone also worked to get in touch with WikiLeaks to understand forthcoming dumps of documents obtained from Russian government-related hackers and communicated with top Trump staffers about the conversation. In any case, he publicly predicted WikiLeaks releases. In June of 2016, Trump's son-in-law, and campaign chairman met at Trump Tower with a Russian attorney who they expected would give them negative information about Hillary Clinton. They'd also been told that the Kremlin supported Trump's campaign. They did not report the contracts to law enforcement. Later, when the New York Times got wind of the meeting, President Trump released a false and misleading statement about it on his son's behalf. The Trump Tower meeting and the Moscow Tower planning were among the more than 100 contacts that Trump and his aides had with Russians between the start of his campaign and the inauguration. Several of them have pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about those contacts, including Michael Flynn and George Papadopoulos. Another, Carter Page, offered confusing and seemingly contradictory accounts about his interactions with Russians during testimony to members of Congress. Collusion happened. The question be what Trump knew about it and when. Now, he must have known everything at all times because Trump also lied about paying off two women who have alleged to have had sexual affairs with him. Initially, the president said he knew nothing about the payments. Later, he acknowledged learning about them. And Cohen later said in court that Trump had instructed him to make the payments, effectively implicating Trump in a crime in an account implicitly backed by federal prosecutors. Whether Trump formally committed the crime of obstruction of justice remains unlitigated. We know it's not unfounded, it's downright true, and undeniable. It's simply still unlitigated. Now, whether he did so or no, he has fought relentlessly to undermine and block the Russia investigation. Most recently, in a tweet saying, "The witch hunt, so bad for our country, must end." Now, that was a tweet from Friday morning before I vanished into party land after our remedial transmission that night. Now, according to contemporaneous quotes from James Comey, Trump pressured the then FBI director to drop an investigation into Flynn. He fired Comey after he declined to do so. He lambasted former Attorney General Jeff Sessions, both publicly and privately, for recusing himself from Russia-related matters and refusing to end the probe. He has threatened Mueller publicly and reportedly attempted to fire him. According to a recent Times story, Trump tried to have his hand-picked U.S. attorney take over an investigation from the Southern District of New York. His cries of "witch hunt" have become so frequent that they barely penetrate the consciousness. By any plain English definition, he has worked strenuously to obstruct a full accounting of his own actions. Taken together, these incidents paint a vivid and consistent portrait of a president who be chronically dishonest, does not respect the rule of law, be frantic to avoid being investigated, hires people without strong ethical bearings, and has placed himself in a position to be compromised by Russia during the campaign. This doesn't even get into the chaos and mismanagement of his presidency, the many scandals of his cabinet members, his boasting about sexual assaults, his encouragement of attacks on the press, and any number of other offenses. Now, whether one believes that this merits impeachment should simply guarantee that Trump be not reelected in 2020 or be entirely acceptable be largely a matter of personal taste and, most certainly, political allegiance. But if one is not already convinced that the president's behavior be unacceptable, it would require an immense revelation to change one's mind, if that's even possible. Conversely, if one looks at these facts and believes they merit impeachment or another sanction, then standing sentry for a nebulously timed, nebulously structured report hardly seems worth the effort. One possible reason for the anticipation be the expectation that Mueller's report will vindicate Trump, which the president be likely to claim no matter what it says. But as the preceding recitation of facts that I've articulated betrays, it's already far too late for vindication. Another reason for anticipation be the hope among Trump critics that a final smoking gun might emerge that will cause a substantial group of Republican members of Congress to break from Trump. There may well be bombshells in Mueller's report, or in indictments between now and then. The special counsel has repeatedly shocked even close observers with new revelations and details. But the number of smoking guns already in plain sight make it hard to believe that a new one will have an effect on Trump's Republican allies that the earlier ones have not. Mueller's report, or whatever version of it the public sees, will be an important document whenever it emerges, but it needn't, and probably won't, radically change anything about the basic story. You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows, and you don't need a special counsel's report to know what kind of president Trump is. Now, to see exactly what he is, you do need Douglas Dietrich. Because only Hitler's son in the German, a kind of title if you will, can tell you that Trump shut programs down completely that were designed, established to counter violent extremism. He did this because under orders of Vladimir Putin, they would have inhibited Vladimir Putin's objectives to kill Americans. Trump wants you fucking dead. If you're white, you're more likely to be a victim than if you're of any other race. Most of the victims of all mass shooters are breeding-age white people. Putin is determined to exterminate, eradicate the white American ethnos. If you're a white American and you admire either Putin or his puppet Trump, you are proving by Darwinian selection you don't deserve to live. Maybe it's best the world gene pool just be cleared of your ilk completely. If you don't listen to me and keep worshiping Trump and Putin, that's what's going to happen. But as your Vulcan intervention, I can only impose upon you to set aside the question of whether President Donald Trump's rhetorical flirtations with white nationalism enabled the mass shootings that we've been seeing from Pittsburgh all the way to the global genocide that was plotted by a goddamn Marine veteran Coastie. And accept that what's undeniable be that Trump's administration has hobbled the infrastructure designed to prevent such murders and conspiracies of genocide. In the waning days of Barack Obama's administration, the Department of Homeland Security awarded a set of grants to organizations working to counter violent extremism, including among white supremacists. One of the grantees was Life After Hate, which The Hill has called one of the only programs in the United States devoted to helping people leave neo-Nazi and other white supremacy groups. Another grant went to researchers at the University of North Carolina who were helping young people develop media campaigns aimed at preventing their peers from embracing white supremacy and other violent ideologies. But immediately after Trump took office, his administration had a primary priority. It immediately canceled both of these grants. In its first budget, it requested no funding for any grants ever in this field. It's not a part of a pattern of neglect. This is an assault on public safety. The grants were administered by the Office of Community Partnerships, which works intimately with local governments and community organizations to prevent jihadist and white nationalist radicalization. In Obama's last year, according to the former director George Selim, the office boasted 16 full-time employees, roughly 25 contractors, and a budget of over 21 million United States dollars. The Trump administration immediately renamed it the Office of Terrorism Prevention Partnerships and cut its staff to 8 full-time employees and its budget to less than $3 million. Under Obama, the Office of Community Partnerships housed an interagency task force on countering violent extremism, or CVE, that included officials detailed from the FBI, the National Counterterrorism Center, and the Departments of Justice, Education and Health, and Human Services. Today, the task force exists in name only. Its staff members have all returned to their home agencies and departments. Salem says that under this administration, who now he himself works at the Anti-Defamation League, mind you, which I've been sourcing for many of the statistics I've been presenting yourselves, and he says from that position now, so Salem says, under the Trump administration, there's been a precipitous decline in the dedicated staff and program funding devoted to combating ideologically motivated violence. This decline, of course, cannot be chalked up to general budget cuts. Although Trump has slashed funding for many domestic departments, he increased Department of Homeland Security spending by well over 7% in his first budget and another 4% in his second. The cuts stem instead from two biases. First, in keeping with their law and order mentality, Trump officials would rather empower the police to arrest suspected terrorists than work with local communities to prevent people from becoming terrorists in the first place, as the Office of Community Partnerships did. Secondly, they believe the primary terrorist threat to Americans be jihadism, not white supremacy. The Office of Community Partnerships committed the sin of working on both. From a public policy perspective, that's exactly what the government should be doing. In 2017, the FBI concluded that white supremacists killed more Americans from the year 2000 through 2016 than any other domestic extremist movement. But Trump advisors have shrugged off these inconvenient facts. In an interview in 2017, White House Deputy Assistant to the President Sebastian Gorka declared that there has never been a serious attack or a serious plot in the United States that was unconnected from ISIS or Al-Qaeda. When critics cited the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, Gorka responded, "It's this constant, oh, it's the white man. It's the white supremacist. That's the problem. No, it isn't." Now, Gorka's wife and frequent co-author, Catherine Gorka, shares his Islamocentric view of terrorism. She has proposed that the United States close radical mosques and bar Al Jazeera from broadcasting in the United States. She's declared American and Western leaders have preemptively shut down any debate within Islam by declaring that Islam be the religion of peace. Now, these views matter because although Sebastian has left the Trump White House, Catherine still serves as an advisor to the Secretary of Homeland Security. In the months following Trump's election, according to The Forward, she asked for the names of employees working on CVE. She led a team that proposed changing the mission from countering violent extremism to countering radical Islamist extremism. That didn't happen. But Eric Rosen, a former senior State Department official, told BuzzFeed that Gorka played a significant role in denying CVE grant funding to groups that work to de-radicalize neo-Nazis and other far-right extremists. When Trump supporters insist that he's a steadfast foe of white supremacy, his critics off-cite his history of ambivalent responses or non-responses to Judeophobia. But Trump's words aren't anomalous. He's put his money where his mouth is. Now, that brings me back to my eternal question. Well, hopefully not eternal, but only presently chronic. Maybe someday everybody will pull their head out of their ass and begin to breathe oxygen. When I think of the terrorism that doesn't spark any panic, Americans should react to violence from religious and ethnic minorities with the same sense of proportion they reserve for far-right extremists, which means they shouldn't react at all and just go on with their lives, and support, of course, full prosecution of the terrorists. On Friday, January 25th of this year, the United States ended a 35-day government shutdown, the longest in history, over President Donald Trump's demand for funding a wall on the southern border. Hundreds of thousands of workers were missing paychecks. Food bank lines in Washington, District of Columbia, were full of federal employees. And air traffic controllers were warning of potential catastrophe, as if the cancellation of nearly 5,000 flights didn't already fit that bill. The president's strategy was predicated on the belief that the more suffering the shutdown inflicted on the American people, the more likely the Democrats were to cave to his demands. But it was all worth it, Trump insists, because the wall be necessary to stem the ceaseless tide of violence from the border. And during his primetime address in early January, Trump said, "The only thing that be immoral be the politicians who do nothing and continue to allow us more innocent people to be so horribly victimized." I mean, again, the obsession with victimization, victimhood. The president regularly invokes violent crises perpetrated by scary foreigners. The announcement of his candidacy began with the declaration that Mexican immigrants are bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. He called for a ban on Muslims coming to the United States after an ISIS-inspired attack in San Bernardino, California. In his border wall address, he pointed to crimes committed by unauthorized immigrants whose victims were bludgeoned to death, beheaded, or stabbed, to argue for the necessity of a wall. But there's one spike in violence that the president never acknowledges and will never mention on his own initiative. And it's the rise in far-right terror that has accompanied his ascension to the White House. So, on Wednesday, last week, the Anti-Defamation League released a report finding that attackers with ties to right-wing extremist movements killed at least 50 people, half a hundred, throughout 2018. That was close to the total number of Americans killed by domestic extremists, meaning that the far right had an almost absolute monopoly on lethal terrorism in the United States last year. That monopoly would be 100% total if not, in one case, the perpetrator hadn't switched from white supremacist to radical Islamist beliefs prior to committing the murder he committed himself to committing. Now, the number of fatalities is 35% higher than the previous year, and it marks the fourth deadliest year for such attacks since 1970. In fact, according to the Anti-Defamation League, white supremacists be responsible for the majority of such attacks almost every year. The 2018 attacks include the one at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue by a man who blamed Jews for the migrant caravan, the mass shooting at a yoga studio by an incel obsessed with interracial dating, and the school massacre in Parkland, Florida, carried out by a student who openly wished that all the Jews were dead. Now, from 2009 through 2018, right-wing extremists accounted for 73% of such killings. That's according to the Anti-Defamation League, as compared with 23% for Islamists and 3% for left-wing extremists. In other words, most terrorist attacks in the United States and most deaths from terrorist attacks are caused by white extremists, but they do not cause the sort of nationwide panic that helped Trump win the 2016 election and helped the Republican Party expand its Senate majority in the midterms. When white extremists kill, politicians do not demand that they be racially profiled. They do not call for bans on white people coming to the United States. They do not insist that white people's freedom of movement be restricted, their houses of worship be surveyed, their leaders be banned from holding public office, or their neighborhoods be secured and occupied by armed agents of the state. And they do not demand that taxpayers foot the bill for a massive symbolic monument that will register America's official disdain for white people in perpetuity. And that's how it should be. It would be immoral to collectively punish white people for the actions of a few extremists, and it would only raise the stature of those extremists, partially legitimize their grievances in the eyes of potential followers, and strengthen their ability to recruit future operatives for further attacks. But that's not the reason none of those things happen. They don't happen because, as America's largest demographic group, white people have the political power and influence to prevent such proposals from even being contemplated. This be a form of political correctness, a PC mandate so powerful that it shapes behavior without even being mentioned or publicly acknowledged. It be simply the way things work or don't work. By contrast, when religious or ethnic minorities commit such acts, they be seen not as individual extremists, but as representative of the groups to which they belong. As such, collective punishment be believed to be justified. This be, in a basic sense, how American bigotry works. White Christians are simply individuals, while everyone else is vulnerable to demonization by demagogues prepared to exploit the fear of those who be different in exchange for political power. The correct response to the rise in right-wing terrorism be not a nationwide panic that mirrors those that accompany terrorist attacks by religious or ethnic minorities. It be to extend the same benefit of the doubt, the same proportionate, measured response with which Americans meet attacks from right-wing extremists to attacks of all sorts. It be to recognize that the constitutional rights of minorities be no less inviolable than the constitutional rights of white Americans, and that anyone who would run on a platform of disregarding those rights is not fit to hold public office. And if you doubt myself, look at Trump's legacy. Hate groups be at an all-time high. That new report from the Southern Poverty Law Center tells us what we already suspected when we see and read news reports. There be a record number of hate groups in the United States, driven by both shifting demographics and trumped-up fears of immigration. The SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center in acronym, giveth us the discouraging numbers, both on its website and its Spring Intelligence Report. The number of hate groups reached an all-time high of 1,020. This is groups, not individuals. These are groups of hundreds of people each, if not thousands. And well over 1,000 and a score of those were extant in 2018. The number was the fourth straight year of hate group growth, or 30% growth overall. If this were a major corporation, you'd be buying stock. In 2018, at least 40 people in the United States and Canada were killed by people either motivated or attracted to far-right ideologies, embracing ideas and philosophies that be cornerstones of the alt-right. The report said violence that has traditionally been in the shadows of race extremism be increasingly taking to the streets. During the first few years of President Obama's second term, in disambiguation, hate crimes actually fell by 12%. When Donald Trump announced that he was running for president and started his anti-immigrant rhetoric about building a wall, the number started rising, not only again, but exponentially. Hate crimes grew by 30% from 2014 through 2017. 2018 hate crime figures be not available yet from the FBI because of the government shutdown. Another reason Trump wanted to shut down the feds. This report was released about the same time as the news about the arrest of the Coast Guard lieutenant and self-described white nationalist with a cache of weapons and ammunition in his Maryland apartment, along with a hit list of liberal politicians and journalists. When that went down, the story about the planned genocide as an act of domestic terrorism be shocking enough in and of itself. It's shocking but not surprising, given the rhetoric and influence coming from Donald Trump himself and all his right-wing media. The number of white nationalist groups surged by nearly 50% in 2018, from 100 groups to 148. The previous high of 1,018 hate groups was in 2011, the year my late and sainted Cyrus was murdered. That growth was seen as a backlash against President Obama, but the number started to drop after his re-election. Distribution of hate group flyers had reached an unprecedented level in the United States and spread farther than the usual target of college campuses. Technology and social media have ramped up the speed of hateful rhetoric and online threats, and tech companies are not at all working hard enough to stop them. The hate groups described include the Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazis, white nationalists, racist skinheads, Christian identity groups, neo-Confederates, black nationalists, and anti-alternative lifestyles, or people who want to kill lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender clubs, anti-Muslims, anti-immigrants, general hate groups. Judeophobic sentiment be shared by several of these outfits, so that kind of doesn't need a category. It's kind of universal. And even Trumpian rhetoric apparently isn't enough for these haters. That was the landscape of the radical right in 2018, yesteryear. In the United States, white supremacist anger reached a fever pitch last year as hysteria over losing a white majority nation to demographic change and a presumed lack of political will to stop it engulfed the movement. White supremacists getting pushed off mainstream web platforms, President Donald Trump's willingness to pass a tax cut for the rich, but failure to build a wall and a turn to the left in the midterm elections drove deep-seated fears of an accelerating, state and Silicon Valley orchestrated white genocide. Even Trump's opportunistic November attacks on a caravan of migrants moving slowly north through Mexico was seen as all talk and no action by the white supremacist and anti-immigrant movements. The midterms tended to validate hate groups' fears for the future. Even more angering to hate groups were the dozens of women elected to the new United States Congress, including 2 Muslims. For white supremacists, these newly elected officials symbolize the country's changing demographics, the very future that white supremacists loathe and fear. There is speculation that, the all talk and no action belief could cause some people like Robert Bowers, the gunman who killed 11 people, 11 worshippers at the Pittsburgh synagogue in October of yesteryear. He was motivated to act on his own, like the proverbial lone wolf. And of course, Soros be the frequent target of Judeophobes who claim he wields massive influence in politics. Bowers wrote on the far-right social media Gab. Yes, the same people who brought you BellGab.com and now bring you BellGap.com, trying to kill the Google search engine as a platform for anyone to use, inclusive myself. Bowers wrote on Gab that just prior to the shooting, referencing a baseless conspiracy theory about billionaire and liberal philanthropist George Soros supposedly financing a caravan of immigrants heading to the U.S.-Mexico border, he wrote of that, "I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics. I'm going in." Now that Maryland Coast Guard terrorist, I keep going back to, terrorist suspect actually at this point, isn't reported to be a member of any organized hate groups, but he was most certainly prepared to act alone as a force multiplication motivator. That means, like the Green Berets in Vietnam, they train a friendly population to do the combat. They're just there as advisors. They provide vaccinations, deliver babies, crap to win hearts and minds of the locals. And that's ultimately what these neo-Nazis would have to do if they have any hope of succeeding. Meaning they'd have to give up their unconditional hatred and racism. But when this Coastie, the Coast Guardsman, wrote about his state of mind, what he wrote was, "I never saw a reason for mass protests or wearing uniforms, marching around, provoking people with swastikas, etc. I was and am a man of action. You cannot change minds protesting like that." Wow, gee. This while he was like, getting ready to kill people for being comic book heroes, kill a bunch of people in media, kill a bunch of female politicians who were Jewish, and then, of course, unleash botulinum toxin and anthrax, along with the H1N1 flu, worldwide, and just sit back, take his retirement, and watch everybody die. But Hassan drew his inspiration from the writings and the drug use and suggestions of Anders Breivik, the right-wing extremist who was convicted of 2011 terror attacks in Norway that killed 77 people. Hassan's hit list of potential targets also parrots Trump's language, such as calling Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren Polka Warren. Now, the SPLC report echoes the conclusions of a January report from the Anti-Defamation League, the one which said right-wing extremists were responsible for 50 extremist-related murders in the United States in 1918. The ADL report gives a higher number of deaths than the SPLC report, I note. Over the last decade, a total of 73.3% of all extremist-related fatalities can be linked to domestic right-wing extremists, so per the ADL. Now, summations about the SPLC Southern Poverty Law Center report feature warnings and advice from two SPLC officials. Heidi Beirich, director of the SPLC's intelligence product, says, "The numbers tell a striking story that this president be not simply a polarizing figure, but a radicalizing one. Rather than trying to tamp down hate, as presidents of both parties have done, President Trump elevates it with both his rhetoric and his policies. In doing so, he's given people across America the go-ahead to act on their own worst instincts. And SPLC President Richard Cohen says, "Hate has frayed the social fabric of our country. Knitting it back together will take efforts of all segments of our society. Our families, our schools, our houses of worship, our civic organizations, and the business community. Most of all, it will take leadership, political leadership that inspires our country to live up to its highest values." Now, while prosecutors say charges against the Marine Corps faggot veteran Coast Guard officer Hassan be but the tip of the iceberg, the most salient factor per his case be the fact that as a Coast Guard lieutenant, he used work computers in his planning of both a widespread domestic terrorist attack and a worldwide international genocide campaign. The United States Coast Guard lieutenant spent hours on end planning a wide-scale domestic terrorist attack and worldwide genocide by logging in at his work computer on the job at headquarters to study the manifestos and anus paths of mass shooters. He researched how to carry out sniper attacks and whether rifle scopes were illegal. And all the while, he was amassing a cache of weapons as he ruminated about attacks on politicians and journalists. But Christopher P. Hassan was not an isolated figure. Per the contractor who worked with him, the 49-year-old lieutenant with over 2 decades in the Coast Guard was part of a project to replace some aging cutters in the fleet, tasks that regularly required interacting with civilians and military officials at meetings and on travel. Now, Adam Stoltzberg, a contractor who worked at headquarters and was in meetings with Hassan a couple of times a month, said that politics never came up. You know, we got a word for this in the military. This is spin. It's called ass coverage. This man's under orders to say that about a man who was painfully, openly speaking about his politics. Indeed, he couldn't shut up about them, no matter where he was. So what they're trying to assert, in order to de-implicate all of his fellow conspiracists who want to kill almost every last person living on the earth as much as Hassan does, only they haven't yet been busted, what they do is they get together and say, "Oh, we never talked politics. We're all strictly professional here. When we're not playing gin rummy or pinochle or strip poker with each other and grabbing each other's dicks and ass, then, you know, we're replacing all the parts, maintaining all of the logistics, you know, keeping the quartermaster supplied. Busy work like that, you know." So, per the Coast Guard, it was only after Hassan's arrest last week at his workplace that the chilling plans prosecutors exposed he was crafting became apparent, detected by an internal Coast Guard program that watches for any insider threat. Now, the service spokesman, Lieutenant Commander Scott McBride says the program identified suspicious computer activity tied to Hassan, prompting the agency's investigative service to launch an investigation last fall. Hassan was arrested on gun and drug charges after officials with the Coast Guard Investigative Service and agents with the FBI in Baltimore began probing activities that prosecutors said in court were linked to what they described as Hassan's white nationalist views. Federal law enforcement officials seized a stockpile of guns, ammunition from his basement apartment in the Maryland suburbs near Washington, in the far east side of Silver Spring in Montgomery County. After the hearing in which Hassan was ordered detained, held Thursday, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Maryland, Robert K. Hur, surname spelled H-U-R, said the sheer number and force of the weapons recovered from Mr. Hassan's residence in this case, coupled with the disturbing nature of his writings, appear to reflect a very significant threat to the safety of our community, particularly given the position of trust that Mr. Hassan held with the United States government. See, prosecutors and Hassan's federal public defender sparred over whether it was appropriate to jail him after an arrest for a gun and drug charges, but no terrorism-related counts. The judge, Charles B. Day, said it be unusual to detain a defendant based on the charges Hassan was facing, and that the issue at hand be all about the defendant's state of mind and intentions. Hassan's federally provided public defender, Julie Stelzig, said that the number of weapons he had were modest at best for any average American gun collector. Of the writings the government points to as evidence of his extremist views, Stelzig, his attorney, said, "It's not a crime to think negative thoughts. It's not a crime to think about doomsday scenarios." But with Hassan in court, prosecutors called him a domestic terrorist, finally crossing that white line, who intended to mass murder innocent civilians. Now, before, I believe it was Judge Day, before he gave the government 14 days to bring additional charges, and before Hassan's loyal attorney could file an appeal for his possible release date, Day, the judge, said, "What drives the government's concern be what also gives the court pause." Now, prosecutors said in court filings that Hassan stockpiling weapons for the last 2 years. In doing that, he was spending $14,000 a year on equipment to ready for an attack, whilst he was calling for focus to violence to establish a white homeland whenever he was online. And as he built his arsenal, Hassan read manifestos by the Unabomber, the Virginia Tech shooter, and the Olympic Park bomber, among other domestic mass shooters, and also looked for guidance to the plot of right-wing terrorist Anders Behring Breivik, who in 2011 unleashed those 2 attacks in Norway that killed 77 people. And of course, as I said, but this cannot be overemphasized, according to the records filed by the United States District Court in Maryland, in one of his letters that contemplated creating a biological plague, Hassan said, "I am dreaming of a way to kill almost every last person on Earth." Now, during the raid this month, law enforcement officers seized 15 firearms, over 1,000 rounds of ammo from what they called his cramped basement apartment that was at the line near Prince George's County. And Hassan, who had a bald head and was wearing a pink prison uniform, never spoke a word in court. No one answered the door at the residential address that appeared to be associated with Hassan. Law enforcement officials in Montgomery County also said that while there were calls about loud parties in the area in recent years, there were no calls for service that would indicate anything was amiss at that residence. Now, Hassan joined the Coast Guard in March of 1996 as an enlisted electronics technician and was promoted to Chief Warrant Officer in 2012 and Lieutenant 2015. Extraordinarily rare that someone becomes a Mustang and goes through the ranks to become a commissioned officer from a non-commissioned background. It just goes to show that if you're wearing your politics on your sleeve as a white trash piece of shit, the sky's the limit. Well, now, Mr. Lake himself, Hassan, will remain on active duty until the legal case against him be adjudicated is the correct pronunciation. But he stopped working, of course, for the Coast Guard since his arrest. Hassan was arrested once the FBI and Coast Guard investigators were confident in the strength of the evidence supporting the criminal complaint and warrant. As recently as January 17th, Hassan created a list of traitors and targets in a spreadsheet whilst he was reviewing various broadcast news sites from his work computer. The list included prosecutors like, or what the prosecutors believed to be people like Senator Kamala D. Harris, the Democrat from California, the CNN reporter Don Lemon, well over 24 others. So, unlawful possession of drugs and firearms, as well as advocacy for supremacist doctrine, ideology, or causes, violates Coast Guard policy, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and all its core organization and values. Now, Hassan's access to Coast Guard headquarters has been revoked, I'm happy to report. He held a top-secret level security clearance beginning in April of 2005, and background checks did not find information that merited denying it. Secret clearance typically allows access to information that can cause serious damage to United States national security if disclosed. It'd be considered more significant than confidential access and less significant than top secret access or crypto top secret. Now, Yvonne Carlock, a Marine Corps spokeswoman, said Wednesday last week that Hassan joined the service in December of 1988, serving as an FA-18 aircraft mechanic. His last rank in that service was corporal. Now, federal authorities said he left sometime in 1993, and in June of 1994, Hassan moved over to the Virginia Army National Guard, becoming an infantryman with Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 183rd Infantry Regiment, and, of course, this being sourced to myself by Kurt Rauschenberg, a National Guard Bureau spokesman, who tells myself that Hassan's unit was based south of Richmond near the town of St. Petersburg, or Petersburg. In September of 1995, Hassan switched to the Arizona Army National Guard and left about 6 months later, in March of 1996, exiting with the same rank as when he joined. And property records indicate Hassan moved frequently in his varied military career, including stints in Arizona, California, and Virginia. In 2007, he bought a house in Currituck, North Carolina, just across the bay from the Outer Banks. Neighbors said Hassan lived in the house for several years with a woman they identified as his wife and at least one child. Now, basically, a lady named Delana Ostrander owned the adjacent lot. Her father, Stanley Miakulevich, still lives on the short, unpaved lane, remembers Hassan as a big, gun-toting Coast Guardsman who commuted to work early each morning by motorcycle. He said he was a good-sized guy, so Miakulevich observeth, but I had no problem with him. He was shooting his gun out there one day. When I asked him to stop because I had a daughter in the house who was sick, he said, fine, and that was it. He stopped. And then you get more damage control coming into effect. The ass coverage by Stoltzberg, the contractor who also worked at the Coast Guard headquarters with Hassan, saying Hassan never raised any alarms at the office, that he was tall and muscular with a shaved or bald head, sometimes drove a Harley-Davidson motorcycle to work, but his black leather jacket didn't bear any insignia, and his arm tattoos didn't appear out of the ordinary. So everybody missed, or so they claim, the man they were really dealing with. Now I'm exhausted. I'm going to take off for now. We will cover a little bit about predation to introduce our next show. maybe just finish up a bit with some rounding up of what we discussed tonight. But I think the message be very clear and everyone understands it. This is war. These men want you dead. The only way that you can deal with this is to take my advisements. Eventually, we will clear our land of them. They will be deported en masse. The overwhelming majority of them, in the tens of millions, to outer Manchuria, where the Chinese have built entire cities, totally functional and completely empty, for them to occupy. And then the Russians will be happy to have an extended buffer state into Asia, comprised of white peoples who worship them as a master race, will be happy in their absence, will sever with the southern states, going down to the county level, that those that bear the white majority will simply, in a very, shall we say, fragmented South, will be forced to secede. Whether they want to or not, they are not wanted as part of the Union. And of course, blacks who do wish to relocate to Northern Africa will also be helped in that regard with a state-sponsored and fully supported logistical line for those who do want to go back to Africa, as many have had it so miserable here that it gave rise throughout Black African American history to Back to Africa movements. There is a substantial enough of a population where an American organized Black Africa Corps can be formed, and that can serve as kind of a colonial force in the Sahara, where, of course, much effort can be placed into construction of infrastructure, a form of colonization of an otherwise arid desert land that will help to balance out the demographics of Africa, which geographically, sadly enough, geographically is the majority of it is not inhabited by blacks, who tend to be beneath the Sahel region and more along the equatorial regions of Africa, and then sparsing out again towards the south, which is a collage of different races, from Asian Indians to the Hottentot tribes. They have a different name now, the Khoi people, Khoifu. And of course, many things can be done. In the meantime, the South can be dealt with when we restabilize the rest of the nation state of America. And it will, unfortunately, almost certainly take a civil war to do that. If we wish to avoid that war, then much can be done, such as impeachment of Donald Trump, and ultimately a kind of pacification of the insurgency of the Republican Party. Be that as it may, the majority of them outside of Dixie must be deported. A white homeland should be established. Freedom of association. Those whites who are not Southern or Dixielander should be able to stay amongst themselves in the Pacific Northwest, and that would be a white reservation, fairly vast in its territory, as many of the Native American reservations will be expansive as well. A good deal of the West, which is federal owned at this point in history, can become part of a group of autonomous and semi-sovereign republics aligned in a general confederation with the United States. Well, all my love unto all of you who support myself. My best wishes to everyone in Team Dietrich. None of this could continue without them. I want to give thanks, of course, to the input from Daniel Arola throughout our transmission tonight. And without him, of course, we wouldn't have much of the drive-by videos. He was kind enough to confirm our transmission quality. And, of course, he was talked about his own mean craft designed to counter the trolls that we've been describing. He's ever to be supported in that regard. And he does inform us he was never part of the Chippendales tour. Playgirl magazine tours under Tony Valentine, who also knew Caesar Sayoc, was about as far as Daniel Arola went. Well, that's far enough for us, and entertaining enough. He does want us to know that in his years as a male stripper, he worked around many dancers that injected themselves with anabolic steroids. And because of these anabolic steroids, they look great for a while as their bodies are jacked up on synthetic testosterone until they get off the cycle in order to go through many depressing weeks of recovering their natural testosterone stores. What be really funny about this, as Daniel sees it, is that that part of the cycle is where it takes human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG, and that's the urine of pregnant woman that gets injected into them in order to help restore their natural testosterone stores. He never did any of this, but he did study it from observation and lots of reading while he was in the lifestyle. My God, I've never heard of this. I've never heard of it being referenced as such, the female or gynuria, female urine. Human chorionic gonadotropin, gonadopatrine, like gonadopatrine. Interesting. HCG. Well, there you go. And, again, love unto Brother Daniel, and, of course, Brother in Battle Pavel, Brother in Battle Justin White, and Jerry Small, thanks to her, of course, for responding to us and getting back to me with some private messages. I'll try and get to them. A shout out to David Patrick this evening, of course, and again, any number of other people who I've forgotten. Know that you're always in my hearts. Vero Reina Barrera. And she does ask, what does it take to get the power back from so much darkness? Oh, it will be done, honey. It just takes, more than likely, sadly enough, some violence that has to be, shall we say, orchestrated at the military level. Now, that may not be done by our current military junta, which is thoroughly corrupt. I do recommend that on their deconstruction or dismantling, to prevent violence from them, that many of the commissioned and non-commissioned officers, anyone who has a family that is military, where many of these families have grown up on bases, their children have grown up in the military lifestyle all their lives, if they so wish, they should be allowed to retreat onto the Hawaiian Islands and many of the islands of the Pacific, from Guam through many of the Marshalls and these various other islands that have been the Raj of the American military since prior to the Second World War. And I say take all their goddamn useless aircraft carriers with them. These are just vast floating city-states. They're vast floating ghettos. They really are functionally useless in real combat. They would serve mostly as artificial islands for building basically structures around and kind of latching various other houseboats to. You have that situation in South Asia and Southeast Asia where you have cities that float a sea that are rafted together houseboats in essence. You can have an extension of that with these aircraft carriers forming the core of these seagoing settlements that are not necessarily traveling the high seas, but certainly kind of locked into place in the various islands and atolls of the Pacific there. They've been essentially colonized to the point where everyone speaks English anyway. It actually will be a productive way to get the military out of the United States while maintaining them as a kind of consulting body for future purposes. Eventually, of course, they'll probably turn to Japan almost certainly for their nuclear umbrella and just kind of maintain a neutrality. And that's fine enough for all of us. The rest of us can reinstate the draft and build a genuine people's army. And that will, of course, be based out of the majority population which dwells in the cities. And then we can clean out the countryside, round up all of these primarily white Republicans for deportation. And that will ensure a future of genuine peace. It'll usher in a golden American age as we have a one-party state of Democrats and a thoroughly multicultural core that will become the new union based on much of what we have towards New York, going through down in a circuit through much of the southwest of America on towards the Pacific, certainly encompassing in a sweep up towards San Francisco, of course. Well, again, that took us to the bottom of the hour, as intended, and a little bit of geopolitical objective and vision for all of us. And that is, of course, the reality of needing to deal with incompatible and irreconcilable, antithetical paradigms, ultimately based on good and evil. My best wishes to all. Maintain your hope in the future, and we will make it happen.